I wanted to take a moment to talk about our sponsor, Alt21, the foreign exchange and hedging platform that reduces the risk and cost of cross-border transactions. As a board member, there are few better feelings than making a suggestion which adds quick material value to your organisation. I remember when one of our board members saved us $50,000 with a quick introduction to a group discount scheme for one of our key suppliers. I continue to feel grateful to this day. Alt21 can offer exactly this kind of quick win for board members. By using their foreign exchange and hedging services, you could reduce your company's costs by 90%. For a company that has just 10 million foreign exchange exposure through its revenues or cost base, that could be over 300,000 back into the business. Alt21 are so confident that they offer the best value in the market, they show you how much they make from fees in real time before and after any transaction. If you want to save your organisation money on its foreign exchange and hedging, head to alt21.com. That's alt21.com to find out more. Hello and welcome to Enter the Boardroom with Newroll, the podcast exploring what makes great boards and board members. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of Newroll, the board search specialist and market leader bringing science to the art of board hiring. Today's guest, Sir James Wates CBE, is the former Chair of Wates Group, one of the UK's largest family-owned construction and property services companies. He currently chairs the Rugby Football Union, Vestey Holdings Limited, a long-standing family-owned food and farming enterprise, and Tuke, an energy and smart home technology startup. He's also on the board for the King's Trust 50th Anniversary campaign. Previously, he has served as Chair of Family Business UK, the Building Research Establishment Trust, the CBI Construction Council, the Construction Industry Training Board, and co-chair of both Infrastructure Exports UK and Build UK. He was awarded a CBE in 2012 and received a knighthood in 2019 for services to business and charity. Sir James, a huge welcome and thank you so much for being here.
Absolute pleasure.
So I'd love to start by talking about your insider view as the chair of a family business. Because during your tenure as chair of Wates, the business grew from 930 million of revenues to over 2 billion, and with profit roughly doubling over the same period, or 8 to 9% compound average growth rate in a decade. I'm really interested to hear from your perspective during your tenure as chair, what you saw as the key decisions you made that most changed Wates' trajectory during that period.
I think it's a combination of things. I think it's the fact that we had good leaders, so people, in my view, nothing happens without good people. So good CEOs who had ambition for the business. That was a business that was an ambition rather that was shared by the family and the board. But I think alongside that, it was actually shifting our mindset from being a good, medium-sized contractor with a developments business to being more of a provider in the built environment and being prepared to take on bigger projects. So, in the construction business, we moved from a big project being 35 million to a big project being 70 to 80 million. That's obviously moved on even more today. So I think that was one part of it. I think it was being prepared to take on the risk that goes with that. And I think the other key thing was actually recognizing that in our, what we called our living space business at the time, which really focused on repairs and maintenance and frameworks in social housing, that we had a gem that we could really nurture and develop. And we put a lot of effort and resource into that. And I think that has definitely been the right thing to do. That is now an incredibly well-established business and continues to grow and prosper. I think alongside that, it was being prepared to try things, to have a go at things, and if they had the legs to then embrace them and take them deep into the business, but if they didn't, to actually stop doing it. So try fast, fail fast, or try fast, succeed fast, and move on. And I think that was very, very helpful as part of doing that. And alongside that, actually putting in the infrastructure to support the growth of the business. I mean, a lot of businesses grow and they don't necessarily have the infrastructure to support that growth, and then they start to fall down. I think we we grew our infrastructure appropriately to support the business growth.
Can we start by going back to the very beginning of that, where you highlighted the shift in the mindset that you had from being a good medium-sized contractor to being prepared to take on bigger projects, which I think is a discussion that happens in many organizations. What were the lessons that you took from thinking through that decision that might be helpful for them?
Okay. I think it's probably looking at, so if you take on, the rule of thumb in contracting is if it all goes horribly wrong, you could lose 10% of the value of the contract. You could lose more than that, but generally it could be nasty. So a £100 million contract could be a £10 million loss if it all goes horribly wrong. What is the impact of that on the business as a whole? Can the balance sheet take it? Have you got the reserve to deal with it? And what is the chance of that happening if you do all the right due diligence on the way through? You get your supply chain backed up. You have the right professional team around you, people you know. It's actually all of the things that make up a successful project, recognizing that when you're doing a bigger project, those are even more important. So it's all of those dynamics to make sure that you are minimizing the risk. And what you don't want to do is take on a project that is going to bust the company.
So was that a question then of looking at your balance sheet and saying, look, if we assume that 10% is the right base rate for a loss, that we can tolerate a 10% loss on any of these contracts, we have enough to live with that and we can take that risk? As I say, simple as that? Or was there more debate? What was the debate that happened at the board level around that? What were those who questioned that approach concerned about?
They were concerned about, yes, the overall risk to the company. I think they were concerned about, obviously, reputation. If you go for these bigger projects and you get them wrong, it's all over the pages of, the trade rags, and you don't want that. The impact on people in the business. If you're doing big projects, people are excited by that. But if they're going wrong, people lose confidence, and then you become very introverted in your approach to business. But I think it's actually not looking at any one contract in isolation. It's looking at the cumulative effect. Because if you have, over a 3-year period, 3 projects that lose between them 30 million quid, that's going to have a massive impact on the sustainability of the business. Now, it's not going to bust the business, but it's going to have a big impact. And, your shareholders fall out of love with you because you're not producing dividends. Your staff fall out of love with you because you're not producing bonuses, and you get into a downward spiral. So you've got to understand those challenges when you are shifting to a new quantum, I suppose, of project.
That's interesting. So you're looking at the cumulative impact of multiple projects. In episodes 85 and 86, Dan Gardner talked about fat tail risks and how we consistently underestimate not just the probability, but the scale of things that go wrong. And often they happen more often and they're much worse than we think. How did you get yourself comfortable that you were sizing that fat tail risks appropriately?
There are key questions. So let's stick with the contracting side at the moment. What is the cash profile of the project? What is the supply chain you've got in place? Are they known performers? Are they trusted performers? Have they got the scale to deliver? Are they being overstretched elsewhere, either within our own supply chain or in other contractors? Have they got the resources? Because we are incredibly dependent on supply chain. Do we know the client? Is it a client who is in the game for the long term, or is it a client who's just doing a one-off project? Is it an owner-occupier? Is it a serial developer? Is it an investor developer? Is it a trader developer? All of these things impact on the decision-making. And, there are certain ones that you say, well, I really want to be with an institutional investor because they're going to hold that project for the long term. Therefore, they're going to focus on getting the right quality. They're probably going to take a longer view on the project. So they're less focused on the short-term costs of it, more the long-term benefit. They're likely to be constantly in the market. Therefore, they're working with established professionals who we probably worked with elsewhere and we know. And then it reflects down through the supply chain that we go to. And it's actually the key thing is us becoming part of the delivery team very early. If we do that, the more influence we can bring to bear in the shape of a project, the more smoothly that project is going to go.
When you say us, do you mean the board?
Yeah, I mean us as a business and the board being able to challenge the management who bring forward these projects around those issues.
The Third thing you talked about that you did well was what I think Annie Duke, who's one of my favourite authors, would describe as knowing when to grit and when to quit. You said you took lots of bets and then were very good at stopping those that weren't working quickly.
Yeah.
For a board member listening to this who feels they're working with an organisation that's not good at doing that, what's been your know-how that's enabled you to do that well as a board?
I think it's probably being quite clear about what you're trying to achieve. So, what is the market? What are we trying to achieve in it? What's the likely business prospect of getting what we want out of this? And really being very firm around measuring ourselves against that initial business plan. And if it's not working, why is it not working? Is it ever going to work? And not being satisfied with the jam tomorrow. Yeah, we've on a couple of things over the years. We've had a look at healthcare a number of years ago, and we took on somebody to really look into that and try and get us positioned in that. And it wasn't getting there. I don't think it was anything to do with the person we had doing it. It was more to do the market perception of us as an operator was not being an operator of the healthcare sector, because everyone wants to say, "What's your experience?" And of course, when you haven't got it, it's quite hard to say you've got experience. So it's really, was that a market we're ever going to break into at that stage? Probably not. Is it a market we could break into in the next 2 or 3 years? Very probably, because the whole business is in a different place now.
One of the issues I've come across sometimes is it's hard to know, especially when you've got a new person in a new area, to know whether it's the person, the area, or just whether it needs more time. Can you bring it to life for me with an example, whether it's healthcare or another one, that allowed you to reach the conclusion that it was the area versus the person, or just simply more time that was needed?
Yeah, I think I'll give it a sort of double answer to this one. So on the first part, we've over the years said, should we or should we not be in civil engineering? A few years ago, we had another look at it, and we brought somebody in who was very experienced in civil engineering with a real ambition to get into that. And it became apparent quite quickly that to do that, we would have to acquire. And to acquire a civil engineering business, it can be quite expensive. And at the time, we had competing requests for capital investment, and we had to make the strategic decision, is it going to be this one or that one? And we just concluded that because of the risk of going into a civil engineering business, which we didn't really know a huge amount about, in spite of the fact we had this very good person driving it, we felt that actually the competing request for capital was probably a better way of allocating the capital, which we did. And I think it did turn out to be that way. We still have a twinkle in our eye. You never want to let these things go. And you can't do everything at once. And I think that's the one thing that we are, as a family business, privately held, we are capital constrained. Therefore, we have to allocate our capital very cleverly. And therefore, we want to put it to where it's going to have the most chance of real success. So we might make a decision 5 years ago that we revisit 5 years down the pike and say, actually, now's the time to do it. I'm not saying we're buying a civil engineering business tomorrow, by the way. But nonetheless, you've always got to have your eyes open to opportunity. Recognize that you can't do everything.
It sounds like you're adding a third option to Annie Duke's quitting versus gritting, which is quitting versus gritting versus postponing, or kicking it down the lane until the opportunity is right.
I would say never.
The final piece you talked about in that beginning opening of decisions you got right was the people and the CEOs. Now, you appointed 3 CEOs in your decade as chair. Curious to hear what patterns you see now with the benefit of hindsight around what worked and what didn't, and the role the board played in making each successful.
Okay. I think it's right person, right time. I think that's very important. I don't think there's a standard template for a CEO, certainly in a family business. I think it's, what are we looking for now? What are we looking for our leader to achieve? What do we want him or her to do? What can they bring to it? And then alongside that, do they get the family? Do they get our values? We have had people who come into the business who really think the only way to go forward is to go to the market and go to the public markets and sell the business. Well, that's not in our DNA. And it's then working with people who actually get what the family want to achieve, understand the long-term ambition of the family, and then for their moment in time, they contribute to that wholeheartedly. And I think it's chemistry between the chief executive and the family owners of the business is very important. Chemistry is always important anyway between chief executive and board. But when there's family around who, are looking beyond even a 3x3 term appointment, we're looking 20, 30 years hence. You've got to have somebody you think is going to add to the luster of the business during their tenure.
It strikes me that many board members still underestimate the significance of that CEO appointment as in terms of the value that they can add as board members. If I were your prospective CEO, what are the things you'd be drilling into in order to figure out if I were the right person for the business that a board member listening to can learn from?
Yeah, okay. I think do you understand the gem, and it is from a family point of view, the gem that you are being trusted to nurture for your time in the business. Reputations are hard earned. We've earned ours over 128 years. With the wrong behaviors, the wrong business planning, the wrong performance, you can lose that in an instant. So understanding the long-term reputation and being very keen on nurturing that. I think, do you want to build this business for the long term and build succession planning? I'm a huge believer in succession planning. I don't think many businesses do it well enough, and I put ourselves in that category. I think we're getting better at it. But, if you've got to continually go outside for your CEO, then you're not actually, in my view, doing really good succession planning. You've got to have internal options. And, I always want the CEO to take real accountability for developing his successors, his or her successors. I think it's very important because if you don't, everybody thinks they're infallible, or not infallible, indestructible, and they'll go on forever, but everybody's only a heartbeat away from no longer being here. So what happens if you fall under a bus tomorrow? Who's going to take over? And I don't think enough CEOs apply their minds to that. They're in the here and now running the business, and that's very important, don't get me wrong. But equally, to me, the really good CEOs are the ones who are looking beyond where we stand. I used the analogy from earlier today. You have those who, if you use a skiing analogy, I don't know whether you're a skier, but the really good skiers are looking down the mountain and planning their whole route. The not so good skiers are looking at their feet, where their feet are going. And the better you get, the further ahead you look. You look beyond the one or two moguls, you look down the field and plan your route through. Those are CEOs that I want. Those who really see the path through. And that, I think, then very much chimes with the long-termism that comes from family strategy.
You mentioned you haven't been as good as you want to be on the succession planning. Have you made any mistakes in those succession discussions? And what would you do differently if you went back in time?
I don't think we've made mistakes, because what we did as a cohort of generational owners. So, my father and my two uncles, whilst they're still shareholders, really did step back and let us as a generation get on with it. And, we, the five of us, sorted out amongst ourselves. We worked incredibly hard, and still do work incredibly hard, on working together. And it's, as soon as you become complacent, something will come and bite you on the backside. So we spend an inordinate amount of time with each other. I would say less so now that we are all slightly older and got broader things that we do, but we're still very close. We work very hard on being close. And we took really good external leadership and consultant advice as we were going through the process of succession planning for ourselves. So when we concluded that I was going to take over as the chairman, the five of us had really worked very closely as to how we were going to reach that conclusion. As it happened, I am the eldest, but it wasn't a primogenitor thing. It was very much around looking at the skill sets, looking at what we wanted at the time, looking at the dynamics of the family, and working with outside consultants to give us help. Because it's very easy to lock yourselves away in a conclave like the Catholic bishops do, or cardinals, and wait for the puff of white smoke. Yeah, that's probably not a good way of doing it. So we worked actually with a number of people, but the key thing was identifying where our individual skills were and how we could make those skills work together to get the optimum result. And it was felt that with what I was doing and where I was positioned externally and such, like, I was the right person at the right time to step into that role. And I did it for 10 years, which I thoroughly enjoyed and initially missed enormously. But as I reflect to someone else, it's now given me the opportunity to do a huge amount of other things that are incredibly satisfying. And 10 years is a long time to be in that position.
Can you bring that to life for me with a bit more detail around what were those skills that you collectively identified that you had that the business needed?
I think because it's the family name above the door, I think part of it is industry positioning. I had been very externally focused for a long time in the construction and construction industry particularly. So I was a known quantity out there. I think the fact that I had a very good relationship with Paul Drexler, who did, I think, an incredible thing. He actually stepped down from being executive chairman to become chief executive under me to help me become a better chairman. And I very much said to him, look, treat me as roughly as you would, as if, I was another chairman in another business. And I have to say, he was very good at doing that. And it was incredibly helpful. I think the relationship was very important. I think experience, construction at the time was the biggest part of our business, and I was the construction guy, whereas Tim is much more around the housing side, which at the time wasn't quite so big in the business. It's now much bigger. So I think there were a number of things there that came to the fore here.
So it sounds a lot like it was the sort of the industry expertise that you had that was most relevant to the business at that time.
I think so. You'd have to ask my cousins what they think, but certainly that, I think that was the perspective.
If you've ever wondered how to better articulate the value you bring to boards, you're not alone. With Neural Plus, you get expert personalised support. Someone working with you to sharpen your board value proposition. Stay current on fast-moving topics like AI and open doors to more ambitious, higher-profile roles. Head to plus.neural.com to find out more. Across COVID layoffs, health and safety crises, and imagine some family disagreements along the way, as you look back on your time as chair, what's been the toughest decision you've faced?
I don't think there's a single one that is the toughest. I mean, everyone is tough in its own way, but it's probably more around the people side. Because, we are very much a people business, and it's never nice to part company with people that you've worked with for 5, 10, 20 years. That's probably the hardest thing to do, but equally it's probably one of the most necessary things to do. So you have to steel yourself to do that and do it in the best way you can. So that's very tough. But I think, if you go back to the COVID time, I think we were very lucky. We had the CEO at the time, David Allen, was absolutely the right man at the right time to really hold things together. And he put a huge amount of work into helping us get through COVID. And then, of course, we parted company 18 months, 2 years later, because the business had moved on from post-COVID, and we were still being held back a little in COVID mode. COVID time was very much hands-on, command and control. And we wanted to come out of that and unleash people to get going again. And there was, an inherent caution, perhaps, understandable, because it was a troubled time. And, a lot of businesses didn't survive it, but we did. But those are tough times.
Amy Edmondson, who was a guest in episode 100 of Enter the Boardroom, talked about a case study of a family business where their philosophy was that everyone should suffer a little so that no one suffers a lot. And is there a way when you're facing those sorts of situations that you can steer through storms using the collective power to shield people? But I'm curious to hear, based on your experiences, if you were talking to a chair or board member who was facing that situation of having to go through redundancies. What advice would you offer to them to help their executive team through that?
I think you summed it up. I mean, I think it is about the greater good of the whole rather than the individuals. And, in a business like ours where we've had, a lot of people work for a very long time, the hardest thing is to let them go. But actually, the business has moved on. The business has got a different ambition, and they're not right for that ambition. And it probably wouldn't be good for them to still be on the train. And it's recognizing that. But as you say, doing it thoughtfully, humanely is absolutely critical. But at the end of the day, you've got to do the right thing for the business, because the business has not only its employees as stakeholders. It has its suppliers, it has its customers, it has communities in which it's working. So, I mean, there are many dimensions to the stakeholder map in businesses that are affected by what a business does and how it goes about what it does. And I think you've got to have a view to the long term of the business in your decision making.
So as you look back at your time as chair of your family's business, what's the single governance practice you'd insist every family-owned board adopt tomorrow?
I've thought about this quite a bit, and I generally think there's almost a reticence in many family businesses to bring in outsiders. I would say don't be scared of outsiders. They bring huge value. Equally, they bring challenge. But I think particularly with non-executives, independent non-executives, I think they bring huge value because they do a number of things. They bring in different perspectives, and they may not be from the same market sector, so they bring much broader business perspectives. I think they bring challenge to the family. They bring challenge to the status quo. I think they are there to help the family challenge the management, assuming it's non-family management. Equally, if it's family management, I think they're there to help the family challenge the family management. So I think they can be incredibly helpful in a family business. And a lot of families would be nervous of that. I would say embrace them because they bring so much more than the risks you might associate with what they can do.
Let's move on to talk about your outsider view of family businesses, because you crossed the table from family insider to independent chair of Vestey Holdings, which is a £1 billion plus turnover, fifth generation family business. Really curious to hear what you've learnt on that journey about operating with legitimacy and influence on the board.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting one because, having spent 40 odd years at Wates, other than the non-executive Argent, but other than that, not only a crust outside, would anybody employ me? And I always said, no, of course they wouldn't. But luckily Vestey saw something. So I suppose to some extent, they didn't do a recruitment. It was symbiotic, I think was the word George Vestey used, talking about family businesses and the challenges they had. It transpired that we're both exactly the same age as businesses, both founded in the same year, 1897, both going through generational transition from fourth to fifth. And, he was picking my brains and so on. And, he was saying, well, we had a go. We went out to the market and we headhunted a chairman who on paper was fantastic. But at the end of the day, he just didn't get the family. And he said, can you think of anybody? And rather cheekily, I said, well, having had the conversation we've just had, I think I might fit the bill. And he said, well, could you? And I said, well, yes, I would. And yes, I can, because I'm no longer chairman of Wates. And I've been in place 2 years now, just over 2 years. And it's fascinating because there are so many similarities in a quite different market sector. So am I bringing value? Yes, I think I am. So bad. Because I'm supportive, but challenging, because I've seen what they're going through with what we're going through. So I'm able to bring, my perspective from our family's point of view to their family. I think that's helpful. And equally from the business point of view, it's interesting. It's another comparatively high volume, challenging margin business. People are critically important to it. Certainly the dynamics are the same. And I think, I'm just perhaps helping them make the decisions they probably want to make anyway, but saying, well, that's the right thing to do. So around HR policies around, being more front foot on communications, about, engagement with staff and all that sort of thing. I mean, they do it incredibly well. And I'm learning a lot that I can take back to Wates and other places through it as well. So it's mutually beneficial. So unlike mutually assured destruction, it's mutually assured improvement. Let's call it that.
Can you give me an example of one practice from Vestey you wish you'd had at Wates and one from Wates you've brought to Vestey?
So at Wates, we're on the journey of, which is actually, to be fair, where we were 30 plus years ago. We had very separated businesses, separate balance sheets, separate P&Ls and everything, operating under an overall group umbrella. We then, in the financial crash of the late 80s, early 90s, for survival, we smushed them all together and we created a massive bowl of spaghetti. We've spent the last few years trying to untangle that. Vesteys are very clear that they have totally separate businesses that have their own P&L, their own balance sheet, and they are very much focused on their particular market sector, internationally or sectorally. And I think that allows them to be incredibly objective in the way they look at their businesses. We are putting that in place at Wates now and creating separated businesses so that we can monitor and measure their performance better. We can actually remunerate them appropriately for the market they're in and the sector they're operating in. So getting away from a one-size-fits-all REM policy to really allowing us to drive performance through the individual businesses that has been, although we're very close to our businesses, been quite hard to really get under the skin of it. And I think now we can do that. Allows us to then objectively make decisions about where we invest, where we look to grow businesses, where we actually say we've got to improve performance there or we do something else with it. It allows us to be much more objective. So that's something that we've been on the journey on, but my time at Vestey has actually turbocharged my desire to make happen in Wates. And indeed, the rest of the board are very much on side with that. So not just driven by me. So that's been good. What do I aim to Vestey? We probably need to ask George that. But I think because I'm from the outside looking in, I think it's objectivity. So George can say, well, I'm thinking of doing this. What do you think? I say, well, yeah, that makes a huge sense. We've done it at Wates. This is what I've done elsewhere. So I think it's more about being a really good sounding board for George rather than anything specific. I think I've introduced people from my sphere of influence, whatever you want to call it, to help them on some of the strategic pillars that they have, particularly around HR and communications. And I think that's an interesting one because it's a very decentralized business, but with a number of key pillars that are very much owned by Vestey Holdings, which is where I sit with the Holdco. And those tend to be around finance, tends to be around people, tends to be around communications, and one or two others. And I think sustainability is another one. And I think I've perhaps introduced them to people who are bringing a different dimension to their thinking around those pillars. And I think that's helpful.
Just going back to your point around the spaghetti versus that more linearly broken out organization model, I imagine the original rationale was that there were synergies between your different businesses that meant having them all together actually made sense. If you were to go back in time, or for a board member listening to this who feels like they're embarking on that same journey right now and they've got a whole load of businesses which are starting to grow that have certain synergies to them, would your counsel be to split them out from the beginning and run the additional cost of the overhead of them being broken out? Or is there a halfway house there? Because the way you painted that, it sounded quite black and white.
Inevitably, there's a halfway house, which is really where we are. So we a bit like Vestey, actually, there are certain things that we believe from a family and business point of view, and this is a debate that's going on at the moment, as to what should be pushed out in the businesses and what should be held corporately. Yeah, and I think reputation for me is one that has to be held corporately, and there are others as well. So I think if you'd be totally purist, you do that. But I think to give within guardrails, let's call them guardrails rather than restrictions, to give the accountability to the people who are, the executives who are running the individual businesses, I think has to be the right thing to do. But we've got to be very clear what we're expecting them to do, how we're expecting them to do it, the criteria against which we want to operate, the values, absolutely critical, and, testing everything we do against our purpose. And I think that if you operate within those parameters and everything can be tested back through those, then I think you can have really inspired, ambitious businesses driven by people who are really getting a buzz out of it. And that's got to be to their benefit and the benefit of the family business.
You said you feel reputation should be held centrally. What were the other ones that you think fall into that category?
And there's always a debate about this. I think treasury. I think absolutely one needs to control the purse strings, but, on a like basis. So, I can see where we get to individual businesses underneath the overarching strategy that the board and the family have set, go forth and develop their business plans to deliver against those strategies. They then come forward with their ambitions and the capital requirements to deliver those ambitions. And inevitably, there's only so much capital around. So the board, at strategic level, then makes the right capital allocations, and the business then have to cut their cloth to suit. But they know what they're doing. They go off and they deliver against that. That has to be something that gets people up in the morning to say, yeah, I'm going to do it. Autonomy, but within guardrails, as I said. So treasury, I think, is very important. I think reputation is very important. I think the people side is very important. I would expect in Wates, and I know it's exactly the same in Vestey, we expect our people to be treated the same across all of our businesses. We don't want to have differentials. I was nicer to work for X business rather than Y business because, the terms and conditions are better, or, you get a bigger car or whatever. No, that's not the way we are. We want people to be treated the same. The values are very important to us. So HR, reputation, that to me comes down to strategic communications. Tactical communications, I think, very much is done through the businesses. And I'm sure there are others. It will be easy for businesses to lose focus on sustainability. So I think sustainability, whilst maybe not driven from the centre, I think needs to be overseen from the centre to ensure that there is consistency around what we're doing in that sphere. Because it may be easy for people leading businesses to look at the bottom line and back off from sustainability because it's a cost. Actually, no, it's a value accretor, but it's hard to measure.
And I guess that's where a family business is so well positioned, because it can think long term. Most sustainability initiatives blow up because people are looking at a quarterly or annual profit line, whereas I suppose at that family holdco, you could look out 50 years, 100 years, and then sustainability is a sine qua non. I want to briefly talk about your role as chair of the RFU, which, for many people might be a dream role. I'm certainly a huge rugby fan. But given what had gone on before you came in, there was a certain amount of noise around the governance of the organisation. Fascinated to hear how you thought about taking on that role, because I guess some people might have looked at it and said, you know what, I'm on a hiding to none here. Why would I take on something that is what could look to the outside like a poisoned chalice? What was the thinking process you went through that might help others thinking about taking on a similar role that they might feel passionate about on one level, but doesn't come without some hair on another?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting one. When I was approached by the recruitment consultants, I said, you've got to be joking. And they said, no, listen, hear me out. This is why it'll be good for you. So I did, and I considered, I thought, well, yeah, maybe there is something I can do here. So the challenge is in governance perspective, there's a challenge between the role of the council and the role of the board, who does what. And the board is there to run the business of the RFU. And my role is to chair that board. The role of the council is to ensure that what the board does is of benefit to the game of rugby in England. And that's from the national side through the community game. And I thought, well, I can see similarities between a family owning business and a business board. I saw similarities with some of my experiences in other things with Construction Industry Training Board, where we had a massive council and we moved that to an advisory council with a board to run the business. That was a good move. Similarly, at the building research establishment, we achieved something similar. So I thought, maybe there's my experience of doing that can help. I'm very clear. I'm not there to run Rugby. I'm there to help the board run the business of Rugby. And I think already my sort of business experience is being helpful. My passion for the game is also helpful, I think. I have a knowledge of the game. I wouldn't say an elite knowledge, but a knowledge and understanding of the game I think is helpful as well. So there's not as if I'm cold to it. And it is absolutely fascinating. What I've found is that everybody engaged in Rugby, they're generally incredibly nice people. They are generally absolutely passionate about the game. They passionately believe in how it should be run. And they all believe it should be run in a different way. So it's great fun.
Sounds like a family business.
Well, I do say to people that there are similarities, but it's early days, Ollie, but I'm enjoying the challenge. I really am. And I am doing quite a lot of listening at the moment, following my own advice. And it's going to be a journey, but I think I generally think that in England Rugby poised to be exceptional from a playing perspective and an administration perspective. I think we can be exceptional. And I'm really excited about that.
I'm sick of hearing other nations saying if England actually gets its act together, it'll be impossible for anyone else to win. So I hope you're going to be the one who finally helps us get our act together.
I want.
Time has flown, which means it's time for the lightning round, where I'm going to ask you a short question and ask you for a quick response if you're ready.
Okay.
Best book every board member should read and why?
I'm going to give you two. I think the first one is The Art of the Deal by Donald J. Trump, just because you've got to try and get some insight into what's going on in that head. Probably quite a fun read too. And the other one, I think, it's a classic. It's Michael Porter, Competitive Advantage. Understanding that, I think, is very important.
Boardroom behaviour that irritates you most?
People texting and doing emails during a board meeting.
Most valuable board ritual?
I think the NED's only session at the end of a board meeting.
Favourite quote?
If, by Kipling, the whole poem.
Most significant professional insight?
You've got two ears and one mouth, use them in the right proportion.
Worst professional advice you ever received?
It was from a mortgage advisor in 1992. It was to take out a 10-year fixed-term mortgage at 10%. Interest rates then went down.
What have you changed your mind on about boards over time?
I think we've moved, the move from from operational to strategic. I used to enjoy the operational side of boards, but actually the strategic is where it really matters.
When was the last time you got a significant judgment call wrong in the boardroom, and what did you learn?
I think it was very early on in my tenure, actually, the first time that we'd had a real look at a civils operation. And we'd come forward with a proposition, and I misread the room. I felt that we weren't going for it because I didn't want to. Whereas the room said, actually, we should go for it. At the end of the day, we didn't. So I was probably right.
And what was the lesson from that?
Listen carefully.
How are you better today as a board member than when you started?
Experience.
And finally, 3 things our listeners should take away from this episode if they take nothing else.
Challenge all of your decisions against the purpose. Listen intently. And challenge and support in equal measure.
So James, thank you so much for taking the time to share your wisdom and experience.
Ollie, it's been a pleasure. Great talking to you.
If you're ready to sharpen your board proposition and open up access to more aspirational roles with expert guidance alongside you, New Plus can help. As an Enter the Boardroom listener, you get 10% off. Head to plus.newroll.com and use code ENTER at checkout.